developing your football world podcast for the British Football Coaches Network. Our guest today is Dan Evans, an A-licensed coach from Australia. He talks to us about his coaching journey, which takes him through many different roles in Australia and the USA, including technical director and coach educator. Enjoy the show. Dan, thank you very much for joining us. How are you today?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, very well. Very well. Yourself?
I'm doing really good. I'm really looking forward to talking to you and learning a lot about your journey, and specifically a lot about Australia. So just for the audience's sake, where are you right now?
Right now, I'm in my house in Perth, Western Australia.
And it's about 3:15 here on the south coast of England. What time is it over there in Perth?
Yeah, so it's 10:15 p.m.
Where are you from originally?
That's a good question. So I've snuck onto the British podcast, but I do have dual passport. So no, I was born in Perth, West Australia. My mother's from Essex and my father's Welsh. So I spend a lot of time growing up in the UK. So I consider myself both Australian and British.
Now, with the Men's World Cup draw up tomorrow, yeah.
What's that?
With the Men's World Cup draw up tomorrow, let's say worst case scenario that Wales are still in it, aren't they? They can still qualify?
They can, yeah.
And Australia have got the playoff against the UAE, and England were already there in pot one, thankfully.
So, yeah.
There could be a chance the three of them end up in the same group, what would that do to you?
It would be a headache. I'd have to buy 3 different strips. No, fortunately, in some respects, they don't often play each other. But I typically go for the underdog. So it would probably be Wales and Australia I'd be supporting ahead of England. But again, that's purely for the underdog perspective. But that end, you know, I like to be supporting the country that I'm working in. So, you know, I spent time in the US, and when I was working in the US, obviously you want to see the national team do well there. So, yeah, hopefully Australia qualify. They've not had the easiest of runs, so it's a bit up in the air at the moment. Yeah, we'll see.
So that reminds me, just on that, Australia moved from OFC to AFC, must have been a decade ago. What benefit have you seen from that?
A bit more than a decade, I think. 2006 could have been their last OFC qualification route. I might be wrong on that, but I think that was, they beat Uruguay in penalty shootouts.
I remember watching it on TV.
Yeah, it was the first time we'd qualified in something like 30 odd years. So that was a big moment for the game. And fortunately, we've qualified for every World Cup since, although it looks a bit tenuous this time round. So see how we go.
But do you think that ultimately it's had a positive impact on Australian football?
The qualification, you mean?
Changing from OFC to AFC.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think so. And I think possibly even more than football, it's had some positive effects, I think, politically too. But sticking to football, I think it's made the qualification route harder for us. We don't necessarily get that one tough playoff game that we used to get via OFC, but it's consistently both in senior and youth tournaments, qualifications are a lot harder. But I think we're playing better opposition, which I think overall has benefits for our game. I think also it's seen a little bit more movement of players and coaches throughout the Asian region, which again I think is positive for us.
Well, I've got so many questions I can ask from that. It's fascinating.
Far away.
I've never ever been to Australia, and I've said it before how I think as I'm getting older, I would be quite upset when I do eventually go to Australia, just how much I would likely enjoy it, and therefore how annoyed I would be at myself for not having gone there sooner.
Yeah, look, it's a beautiful place. We've certainly got challenges on the football landscape, but they exist. I think whatever country you operate in, there's pros and cons to each environment. But yeah, look, it's from a lifestyle perspective. It's a great place to live. It's not always the cheapest place to live, but it's a beautiful country. There's a lot of open spaces, and it's a large country. I know we were speaking before the recording. We've got a country that's almost geographically the same size as the US, and I think the US has 300 and odd million, and we've only got sort of 22, 23 million in the country here. So yeah, a lot of open spaces. Most of the opportunities are in the major cities, sort of, which are predominantly coastal based. But yeah, it's a big country with some vast open spaces.
Before we get back on track and go through your journey, I'd just like your opinion on a few things, because you've mentioned that, the size of Australia, a lot of countries do have problems geographically, and found in the US that you got kids would regularly go 5 to 8 hours for an away game and think that was perfectly normal. Whereas here, I've had kids pull out of fixtures because their parents can't be asked to drive 20 minutes. And
yeah,
so what kind of problems does the geography, the climate, and even the culture pose from a football perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Sort of unlike you're right in what you say in the States. It's not unusual for kids to play in tournaments, even 10 hours away, and that means a couple of nights in hotels for the parents or whatever the case may be. In Australia, it's basically at the youth level, and even in the levels under the A League, it's basically state based. So you play within your state. So on the West Coast, I think there's one team in the semi-pro game that's a couple of hours away. Other than that, you're probably traveling 40, 50 minutes as a max every week. That might change a little bit more over East. But predominantly, if not exclusively, you're traveling within your state. The challenges with that arise is, even though we've got sort of second, third, fourth, fifth tier competitions, predominantly they're regionalised. So the best teams from Western Australia don't necessarily play the best teams from New South Wales or Victoria, and if they do, it's in a one-off type game. That's got huge challenges for us on an elite youth level, because obviously you want the best playing with the best at the youth level. One, so they can obviously develop and grow in a way that's going to be productive for them, but also for us, looking at national team selections. You want the best youth players playing with the best youth players consistently, and unfortunately, just because of the way we're set up geographically, that doesn't happen here. So that's one of the probably the major challenges. But we can't change the size of our country, so that's something that we've just got to try and overcome to the best of our ability.
Do you find those constraints affect potentially the demographics of participants in youth sport?
Potentially, yeah. I certainly noticed that more in the US, where you could say it was more of a middle class game there. Sort of the inner city demographic kids. Basketball was their sport. They weren't really growing up playing football. I think in Australia we're not quite as far along the continuum in that regard as the US, but certainly there are costs involved, with the travel, with the clubs that make it that can make it challenging here, because you worry that maybe the best kids are getting priced out of the game, and I know that's something that it's a challenge in Australia. It's certainly a challenge in the US, but I'd imagine in a lot of the Western world countries where there's sort of less street culture now, and it's sort of school and club based. I think that's a challenge that we've all got to overcome.
I think it's definitely starting to, in a lot of countries I've seen, where obviously football is dreams and aspirations, and it's a potential lifestyle if you're one of the lucky ones that can make it. And so there's a lot of unscrupulous people that are selling snake oil, that are trying to willingly or otherwise dupe parents. And that's where the fake academies come along, and a lot of the one-to-one coaches that are charging a fortune to make a kid run through some ladders and jump around cones. And that's because, well, if you're not doing it, this other kid will, and this other kid will get picked. So there's a lot of that creeping in here. And I noticed it after being away for a few years, coming back, I started to see a few of the American ideas and practices that we would reject have found their way into grassroots sport in England. And I don't like the trend. I think we've got enough good people here to ultimately fight against it. But I don't like that it is happening. So yeah, I do see it happening in a lot of places.
Yeah. No, look, it does happen here as well. With these private academies, and I use the word academy there. I'm not sure that's accurate, but private training organisations would be a better way of describing them. To some degree, they operate in a market that perhaps organised clubs should be operating better in themselves. So perhaps they fill a little bit of a gap in the market. But certainly in the States, there's a lot of people that have made good money in a service that might look appealing or attractive to parents, but in fact offers players very little. And as you've said in the UK, and certainly the case in Australia, that has crept into the game here. And I'm not suggesting that there's no place at all for private training organisations, but I would say, as I guess a word of warning for parents and players, I think you need to be careful what you invest in.
Yes. A lot of what I've seen now, of course, it's not everybody. There's some very good people out there doing very good work, but a lot of it to me looks like you are kind of paying someone else to be a dad for an hour, rather than just taking your kid to the park and kicking some balls around. You're paying some bloke in a tracksuit a substantial amount of money.
Yeah,
I think that time would be best spent just making up games with your own child. I know that is a luxury, that in itself is a privilege. Not everyone has got the time. Not a lot of kids grow up without parents that being there. So I get that. It's something we definitely have to be careful with. So
yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about you, how you got into coaching in the first place, and then where it's taken you from there, because you spent a lot of time in Australia, in the US, and have you done much coaching in the UK as well?
No, predominantly just the US and Australia. I was, in my time spent in the UK, I mean, I've been back to and forth to visit family, but in my early years, I was sort of too young for it. So I've spent most of my time living as an adult in the US or Australia.
So what were your first steps into coaching?
It's a bit of a funny one, really. So, as I've got a younger brother, he's 4 years younger, and I used to just bash balls around in the garden at him, and he started saving them at one point. So I grew up trying to score past him, and then two, trying to turn him into a reasonable goalkeeper, and he played at a reasonable level. So I met that objective to some degree. But I actually I started watching him play at his academy team. I think he was under 11s or 12s, and it was sort of the days where at halftime the parents had wander onto the pitch. There was no changing rooms, and the coach would address the kids in front of the parents. And this particular coach he had obviously wasn't so experienced. And I think at half time on this particular day, he sort of said, here's the oranges and have a drink before the second half, boys. And I actually said to him, do you mind if I say a few words based on my observations? And he said, yeah, go ahead. So I can't remember what I said now, whether it was good or not, I don't know. But at the end of it, he said, great, you're now helping me out for the rest of the year. So I kind of fell into it. Then I found it at a young age. I was probably only 16, 17 at that point. But then I found that at a young age, I enjoyed it. To a point, I think it made me a better footballer because it got me thinking about things that I hadn't necessarily thought about before, or coaches hadn't brought up with me before. So I think I coached my first team at the age of 15 or 16. And then I did a few coaching badges quite young and enjoyed it as well. And then I'd sort of made the choice that at the end of my playing, I wanted to get into it full time if I could. Unfortunately, injuries prevented me from playing beyond the age of 25. I played semi-pro in Australia and a little bit in the States. And I was obviously devastated to have to give the game away because I think playing was my first love. But I was really fortunate that I had made steps already to get into coaching. So I think I had my B license before I retired. And then I got into it. I think I had my first semi-pro men's team at the age of 25. And yeah, I've been coaching pretty much full-time ever since.
Do you think you still would have got into it if you hadn't had given a half-time team talk to your brother's team?
Maybe, but you never know. It was, yes, I think I would have got into coaching, but whether I would have got in as early as I did, I don't know. I sort of had the jump on sort of now all the guys that I used to play with have all sort of retired and some of them are getting into coaching. I've sort of got, 10 years more experience than them now. So even though it was challenging having to give up playing, it's certainly added time or given my coaching a bit more longevity.
So I've got your LinkedIn right in front of you, lots of different roles. Men's assistant coach, women's assistant coach, director of youth academy. You did ODP while you were in Ohio. You've been a technical consultant, head football coach at a grammar school. You've been a coach developer, technical director. That is a wide range of different roles and responsibilities there. Under 19s, even a bit of time spent as a career advisor, I see on here. So what do you see yourself as when it comes to being a coach? Because calling yourself a football coach is quite a broad term. But what do you see yourself as? Are you a director of football? Are you a coach educator? Are you a head coach? Or are you all of them?
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost, I'm a coach. That's outside of playing. That was my next love. I have obviously worked in director positions and currently mixed in with my head coaching role. I'm technical director, so I look after the youth component of my club. And then I'm also doing sort of coach education for the FA. But I think that all starts with being able to coach, and then you can sort of branch off into other areas from there. But yeah, first and foremost, I'm a coach.
What is it you enjoy about coaching?
I think that's a good question. The chance to work with people, I think, is central to why I do it. I like to think I'm a people's person, and I like the challenge of being able to work with people from different backgrounds, and then trying to improve them and get them all to come together and sort of work under the same, the same umbrella. You want to pull people together and get them all working for the team. So I think, that's got its challenges, but I think first and foremost, it's the chance to work with people, and predominantly you share the same love of football. And I think we're really lucky in that regard, because you can travel the world and meet people that share the same love. They might not share the same language, or certainly not the same background, but they'll share the same love for the game.
Yeah, football's a bit like a gateway drug, isn't it? It gets you into different culture, into history, and to languages and food. Just by enjoying football, you find yourself in so many different places if you're open to it, and you get to learn so much about the world and about people and about yourself. And it all happened because we like kicking a ball around, which is quite obtuse.
Yeah, it's crazy when you think about it, but it's so easy to do, isn't it? I mean, really, all you need is a ball, and it's, I think football's played in just about every country in the world, and then in just about all of those countries, not every, but just about all, it's a national game as well. You know, so I've chosen to work in 2 countries where it's not the national game, funnily enough.
We'll get onto that in a bit, because I've got a few questions around that. It is good to see the amount of different formats available for football, and different federations support to different degrees. But around here, beach soccer is starting to get quite big. The FA in England are starting to, well, not the FA specifically, but taking seriously a national futsal league. And you see recently a lot of jobs for coaches of para football. So it's a game which you can adapt in so many different ways to play in a whole variety of ways, which are applicable to so many different circumstances. I think that's part of the beauty of it, and part of the wide-reaching appeal of it. So let me ask you then, what are your ambitions career-wise? Do you want to stay in Australia? Do you want to go USA? Do you want to go somewhere else? What kind of
roles?
Look,
I think I'm open as far as that goes. I've always wanted to challenge myself and push myself to coach at the highest level that my ability will let me. And if I'm at that level now, so be it. I've got definitely aspirations to step up. We'll see if I can make that jump over time or not. But I think predominantly I enjoy first team coaching. Obviously the technical director side of things and the coach educator side of things, I also enjoy. But first and foremost, I mentioned before, I want to be a coach, and I'd like to coach sort of first teams at the highest level. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see what eventuates.
So the list of roles I've got here in front of me, it reads like a scroll, like it just unfurl and go forever. What do you think is the role you may have enjoyed the most?
I've enjoyed all of them for different reasons. I think one of the jobs there, Murdoch University, Melville, that was their first year in the semi-pro football, and I coached them for 2 years, and I think we finished 4th and 6th, so we didn't win the league, but we were competitive. But I also started the academy there. I think now they're one of the more successful, certainly from a numbers perspective, but also results-wise, they're one of the more successful West Australian academies. So I think I enjoyed the work that I did there, and then sort of years on, I can see the benefits. Obviously, other people have taken it up and run with it now, and done well. So good luck to them. But I think I've enjoyed, for want of a better word, the legacy that potentially I've left there. But I think what I enjoy most, as I said before, is the relationship with people, and I'm really enjoying my role at the moment with Swan. It's one of the smaller semi-pro clubs in West Australia, but trying to work in changing the culture and being successful on the field, but then also giving them systems and structures that hopefully they can be successful a long time after my tenure with them is finished.
I want to go a bit deeper there. So you're changing the culture. What does it look like, or what did it look like, and what are you trying to get it to?
Well, I think from the youth side of things, Swan, for example, has been a very good community sort of recreational club where anyone can come and play, and I think that's fantastic. That's a great starting point. When you've got a semi-pro men's club at the end of it, I'd like to offer more for the players that have the aspirations to go to that level and perhaps beyond. So I think, what we've done well, as I mentioned, and, certainly before my time at the club, but they've done well at being a club for anyone. And I think that's great. If that can continue, fantastic. But I'd also like to offer a service more for the players that see football, whether it's as a career, but they see football as something that they want to achieve higher levels with, and I think that's perhaps an area at the club that we've identified that we could improve in. So I guess you could say, to an extent, that's changing the culture. It's certainly changing the landscape slightly, and whether the culture does in fact change, I think is something that you can look back throughout the course of time. So I don't necessarily see it as this is Dan Evans coming in changing culture. I just see it as me offering perhaps different services that we've had before, perhaps improving coach education and improving the overall experience for the players. And then if in fact over time that means a cultural shift, then great.
Have you found any challenges in trying to, I think I might describe it like ticking two boxes? You want to create a pathway where players take it seriously and can go into senior football, but you also want to be able to offer opportunities for all players of all abilities and all motivation levels to play and compete and to learn. Is it hard to do both at the same time?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's hard to do both at the same time with limited resources and using the same people, if you like. And that's a challenge, whether you're at one of the bigger clubs, which I have been. I mentioned sort of Murdoch University, Melville. They're probably the biggest, if not, they're one of the biggest clubs in Western Australia, sort of numbers wise. And then with our club, we're one of the smaller ones. Regardless of whether you're at a bigger or a smaller club, I think that challenge exists. I think when you're at a bigger club, you can potentially diversify a little bit and have sort of different streams, if you like. You have your more competitive stream, and then you have your more social stream at a certain age. I don't suggest bringing that in at the earliest of ages. I think you need to be definitely inclusive at those ages. But as I mentioned, when you're one of the smaller clubs and your challenge is numbers, both in players and coaches, I think it does make it very hard to do both of those things that we've mentioned at the same time. But I also think you've got to be honest enough and say that if you can't offer a particular service to a player, then why not help them find another club in the area? I know we want to be competitive and that sort of thing's often not done. But if you've got a player that outgrows the current circumstances or the current service that you're offering, why not help them find another vehicle that's going to be beneficial for them? Rather than trying to make it work and then have that player leave you in a couple of years anyway, potentially feeling that they haven't been treated well. Why not try and find them the right pathway sort of here and now?
As you said that, in my head, I saw plenty of ex-colleagues in the US that would have had a heart attack. So you mean if we haven't got anything for them, we find somewhere else for them to go? But why? We'd lose money doing that. Why would we do that? Unfortunately, I don't think any of them listen to this. So I'm pretty sure their health is okay, but that would have shocked a lot of people. to hear.
Well, what I've just said there might have got me sacked in the US.
Religious.
Fortunately, we're not quite as cutthroat, certainly on the West Coast in Australia. But yeah, look, I'd like to think, and certainly the reason I do it is more than seeing kids as dollar signs that walk into your club. Yeah, I think, you know, if you can't offer the service, then I'd like to think we pass them on. But yeah, you're right. There'd be some directors that would have a heart attack over that.
So that's very much a human approach, a player-first approach. You do what's right for them. Alluding to what you were saying earlier about how you coach. So you're talking about creating systems and structures that last longer than your tenure at the club, because essentially you're looking for something to grow. And it would say that you're planting seeds for trees whose shade you would never sit underneath, which I think ultimately is what coaching youth is all about. It's not about, so you got a bunch of 10-year-olds, don't really care about winning the game today in the bigger picture. I care that I can develop them today so that they win the game when they're in their 20s. If that makes sense. It's competitive. We still want to win, but some coaches are focused on winning today, and I'm focused on winning the bigger game. It's still a level.
Yeah, look, it's a competitive game, and the objective is to win. So, of course, players, coaches, everyone wants to do that. But at the younger age groups, is it more important to win games than it is to develop players with a long-term goal of having them win where it really counts in senior football? And I've always said that I'm prepared to lose games for youth teams if we're playing in the right way as far as development of players go. And you know that not everyone may share that view, which is fine. But yeah, I think we've all seen at the young ages the parents and coaches that are out there purely to win games, and how many of those parents and coaches and kids are in the game in 5-10 years time. In my experience, not many of them are in it for the long haul.
Yeah, at times it feels like self-sabotage, because you're playing in a way where you could look at the fixture and say, well, if we put these kids in these positions, in this formation, and play this strategy, we will increase our chances of winning the game today against our direct opponent. Whereas if we put them in this system and give them these instructions, we're less likely to win today, but they'll become better footballers, and therefore they're more likely to win more games tomorrow. And that's a hard one for people to marry up and to understand that. And I think there's a Cruyff quote, and I regularly butcher the Cruyff quotes about how when he had a player who couldn't kick with his left foot, they put him on the left wing for 6 weeks. Just things like that, because when he graduates to the first team, he probably didn't win many reserve games, but now he can use his left foot at the senior level, which is way more important. So is there a kind of a similar sentiment in Australia to what you get in the US of a short-termist approach to kids, or is it a bit more relaxed? Is it a bit more long-term from the average parent, the average coach?
If I was to directly compare the two environments, I mean, Australia's, I think, more of a relaxed country generally. So perhaps that sort of comes out even in youth sport. But certainly, there are still your nightmare parents, if I can say that. But the US, I found, far more competitive at the younger age groups. Having to justify, as a director of a couple of different programs over there in my time, having to justify to, U8, U9 parents, the whole development versus winning at all costs mentality. And I say justify because, I mean it in that respect. Certainly I think communication with parents is key. and letting them know your philosophy in and around youth development. But there are some that really don't buy into it, and it's for them win at all costs. I think all I've got to say is, again, this might have got me sacked at various times, but I think you've got to be prepared to lose those players and for them to go, potentially poison another environment. Unfortunately, I think that's a reality sometimes, that you're far better off working with the ones that want to buy into what you're doing as far as development of individuals and clubs go. I think you're far better losing the ones that are going to be a hindrance to that.
There is a huge tangent we could go down here, and I'm going to be careful we don't, because this rabbit hole is deep, but I find in 99 times out of 100, it's the parent and not the kid or the player. Even when they get to quite older age groups, it's always the parent that causes the problems. However, coaches have got lives. Not all coaches work full time. And so the amount of time and effort required to win over those parents might not always be worth it in the long run, because if you look at it like you've got a certain amount of resources that you can use, that finite amount of resources. How much of those resources do you dedicate to what is potentially a low probability win in getting that parent to sit down, shut up, understand long-term player development, and stop badgering the coach, stop badgering the players, then weigh it up with your own sanity as a coach, and then those resources being diverted away from other players and other parents potentially. Yeah. I think it's a hard one to know when to cut loose. It's the easier option, and it's I think often the more rewarding option when you turn up to that first session or that first game and that parent's not there. Oh wow, this feels like a different club altogether. But
yeah,
we are to an extent taking it out on the kid, because it's the kid that gets excluded because the parent's a dick, and it's not the kid's fault. 99 times out of 100, you do get some that are a problem themselves, but yeah, mostly it's the parent. So I don't know, where do you fall? Where is your line? I don't know where mine is.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Certainly I've had kids that are challenging, but I think that's part of the work we do, and I've actually, it's made me a better coach in overcoming a lot of those challenges. Not sure I can say in every instance that I agree with that comment when it's directed towards parents. You're right. I think at senior level, we look at if the baggage outweighs the ability of the player, then you normally let the player go. And I think in youth football, you've got to look at that, but almost put the parents in that comparison. If the baggage of the parents as a package overweighs what the player can bring you or to your culture, and I'm not talking about wins or losses, but if the parents outweigh that, then maybe it's a time that they find another environment, and typically I'll say that when there's the challenging parents, in 5-10 years time, as I mentioned, their kid's not in the game, and that's a shame, but I think they end up ruining it for their own kids. I'm sure everyone can think of exceptions, but very rarely do you come across a problem parent whose kid makes it to the top level. That's certainly in my experience anyway.
Well, I like that. You've got my mind racing now. So does the baggage of the parent outweigh the ability of the kid? And I'm thinking, with a bit of time and effort and some research, we'll be able to come up with a mathematical formula for that, because I'm sure there's got to be some formula somewhere that people more clever than I can work that out. So
I'm sure someone's got a lift somewhere, and if they're listening, I'd love to see it.
Oh yeah, board behind me. I'll get our pens out and such, and I'll work out this equation. So let's now talk about a role which might feel incomplete, somewhere that maybe you wish you had a bit more time, or you were able to do a bit more. And I suppose with the pandemic, the last few years has been completely up in the air, that a lot of people have got very recent jobs that they wish they could have done more with?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You know, I don't think there's a role that I've had where if I had more time, I could have done more with, you know, but 99% of the time, well, I've been fortunate that 100% of the time when I've moved on, it's been of my own decision. I'm sure that'll change at some point in my career, but I've been fortunate so far. I think by, you know, whatever the role you've got, you can potentially squeeze more into. But I think as I've aged, and whether this is true of everyone or just me, I suspect it's true of everyone as they age. You know, you tend to maybe relax a little bit as far as realizing that you can't do everything in one day. And I think if I had my time again in some environments, I would have perhaps not stressed myself out as much and thought, right, I've got to get absolutely everything done in year one, or I've got to get absolutely everything done within the first 18 months. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think I'd have probably been in some environments a little bit more relaxed and perhaps not tried to force things as quickly as I've tried.
I think a lot of people can relate to that answer. So very good, very poignant. Now, change of direction here. Women's World Cup is about a year and a half away.
Yeah.
What improvements have you seen in the immediate last couple of years in the build up to this? And what kind of effects might it have on the landscape for women's football in the area?
I guess because I've spent sort of 5 of the last 6 or 7 years out of Australia, I probably haven't seen the hype and build up as much as I would have if I'd been in the country. But certainly I think irrespective of Australia's involvement in the World Cup and irrespective of where the World Cup's going to be held, I do think women's football has been growing at quite a rapid rate in any case. And I think things like where the World Cup's going to be held and Australia's involvement, obviously that just accelerates it tenfold. But what I've seen is a move of more experienced and qualified coaches into the women's game. I haven't worked in the women's game in Australia for a few years now, but certainly in time that I did spend in the women's game in Australia, there really wasn't too many qualified coaches. And obviously since then we've had a national league come in, and there's been some, you know, subjectively, but in my opinion, there's been some good coaches that have either developed their career with the women's game or moved over from the men's game, and it's been a more attractive proposition for them to work within women's football.
Does women's football have other sports to compete with in the same way the men's does, with Aussie rules and cricket and rugby? Because I know, well, for boys,
yeah, I mean,
not number one, is it? But is it for
it
girls?
Isn't. Just in your you mentioned there rugby, AFL, and cricket. I'm not sure about rugby. I think they do, but it's perhaps not as big. But certainly, cricket and AFL have massive women's leagues over here, and they're things that have come up since the inception of the women's league in Australia. So I think potentially the women's league's lost a little bit of ground since the inception of the AFL women's and since the inception of women's cricket on the national level. You know, from a women's sports perspective, I think, you know, it's competitive, of course, but I think these things are great if there's a pathway for women's sport, because obviously for a long time there wasn't. From a football perspective, it's definitely a challenge. because now in the same way that the men's compete with those other codes, the women are also competing with those other codes as well. But I think that's a reality. I think we've got to try and be better and offer the best service that we can, so that we not only win some of these athletes over to the women's game, but when we get them, we keep them as well.
Can football ever be the number one sport in Australia, and does it need to be in order to thrive?
I don't think it needs to be in order to thrive. It is the number one sport from a participation perspective, as is. I know, which surprises some people, and I think it's the same in the US. So Australia and the US in that regard are quite similar. Number one participation sports, huge at youth level, doesn't necessarily translate to fans of the game at senior level, and then of course there is a big dropout, and obviously a seemingly lessering in standard when you get to sort of top level men's or women's football, certainly if you're comparing them to Europe, of course. But no, I think the game can still thrive despite all the competition that we have here with other codes. But I think things like a Women's World Cup in the country, you would hope, we move several steps forward, not just continue on the trajectory, but you'd hope that it accelerates things.
I suppose one advantage that women's football has over the other sports is that football is a truly global sport, so everyone plays it, whereas cricket, it is around the world, but it's limited. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, AFL doesn't happen outside of Australia, does it? Not to any grand extent, at least.
No, but even look, cricket, rugby, there might be competitively anyway about 10 nations in cricket, maybe about 15 in rugby, that compete on a real sort of competitive level. Whereas in football, you've got, well, I don't know what the last count is, but you're almost at 200 nations if you're not. And of course, you could argue that not all of them are as competitive as others, but you can see how competitive it is just to qualify for major tournaments. And we're in a position now from an Australian perspective where we might not make one. And I don't think there's a given right that anyone does qualify. You look at Italy, failed to qualify. There's historically big name teams, the countries that are finding it tough. So from the competition perspective, I think you're right. We offer something that other countries and other codes don't. Other codes, I should say. And I think from an experience perspective, if you're looking at it, what's going to give me the best life experience, then I think when you consider what football has to offer globally, I think it stacks up pretty well against anything else.
So my next question is a bit more to do with sociology within the game, and the question isn't loaded, but this comment is loaded. That when I go abroad, I am an expat, but when other people, particularly with darker skin, go abroad, they are immigrants. That's a loaded comment, and I mean that generally. But the question, not so much. I've got no animosity with the question I'm asking here, and that is that Australia has a lot of people from different cultures that are coming to Australia from all over the world. Do the majority of them play football? Are they integrated well? Does it help them get integration within Australian society, or do they go for what I've seen as more traditional Australian sports like cricket? If you move somewhere to Australia, what's going to get you friends quicker, playing cricket or playing football?
Good question. I don't have any sort of statistics to back this up, but I would have thought a lot of it depends on the age that you move to the country. A lot of it we've seen that I think football historically has embraced immigrants that have come to the country, and certainly, if Australian history in football is anything to go by, the game was predominantly built by immigrants. So I think we could certainly do a better job, potentially from an inclusion perspective. But I think that's one thing our game does have going for us, and that's not to say that people that arrive to our shores don't play other codes, because they do. But I think we probably win that battle over other codes with people moving to the country. They typically don't. Well, they won't have moved to the country playing AFL in their previous in their previous life, but majority of them have moved to the country having had some experience in football where they've come from. So I think the challenge for us is, can we engage them and can we get them involved at their school and at their club? And again, I don't have the statistics to tell you how good of or bad of a job we're doing in that regard, but I get the feeling that a lot of them that come over are playing football, whether it's formal football or otherwise.
Looking at it from a purely British perspective now, there's so many Brits in Australia, or people that can trace their heritage back to Britain and Ireland. I'm sure you must have seen quite a lot of Brits go over there in your lifetime. And how do they adjust to Australia? Is it easy? What kind of things do they need to learn quickly?
I'd say that it's, given that our country was not built, but had a strong British influence. Obviously, we're still part of the British Empire, in name at least. So I don't know that it's a huge change. Certainly from a football perspective, I mentioned before, when you travel, football sort of speaks its own language. And I think if you're a British immigrant or an immigrant from anywhere, if you can turn up to your local football club, you're going to find it fairly easier to fit in. And then I think that helps from a societal perspective. I think it probably helps you fit in from that regard as well. I know I've been lucky when I've sort of traveled to the US. You feel you've got a family when you're working, with a football club, when you're working with players. I'd like to think, I guess just to an extent, I'm a local in Australia, but I'd like to think that we can offer that when people come over and settle in our shores. I don't have one piece of advice necessarily, apart from, with a lot of the Brits that come over, maybe put a bit more sun cream on. But other than that, I think they've done a fairly good job of settling in.
It's amazing you say that, because particularly in Florida, the Brits stand out a mile off, because they're walking, and they're often bright red.
Yeah,
there's other giveaways like feeler trainers, which you don't get in the US. But
look, when it comes to burning in the sun, I'm definitely British, unfortunately. I do go bright red.
But one quick question for my own personal interest is, are the fish and chips in Australia the same as what we get here?
You know what? I haven't had fish and chips in the UK for a while. I haven't been back to the UK in a few years now. It's fairly similar. There's not many places that you get mushy peas over here. So if you're a big mushy peas fan, you might be disappointed. But otherwise, I think, there's a lot of similarities. Curry sauce is another thing that doesn't operate particularly large levels in Australia. So again, if you're a curry sauce fan, you might be a little bit disappointed. But otherwise, I think we've got our fish stacks up pretty well.
I've had fish and chips in a few different places where I'm that ignorant Brit abroad, where I go for the easy option on the menu. I'm not going to eat any of this foreign stuff. It might have spices in it, and I can't tolerate that. But it's more like the Americans. They have fish and chips, but it'd be French fries with some fried fish. I'm just wondering, if ever I was to go down to Australia, could I still at least scratch that itch? Could I still get decent chips?
There would be more commonalities than not in the fish and chips, I would say.
Okay, good. So do you find any kind of misconceptions for Brits that go over there, start working in sport? Is there anything that maybe not prepared for? Do you get any kind of silly questions like, do they use kangaroos for goalposts, that kind of nonsense? Everywhere gets it, and people are already school places. What do you find in Australia?
I think there's, and you would know this, that there's probably in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot more movement of Australians in the UK. So I think they've sort of answered the stupid questions for us in a way. So that when people come over here, that they know what to expect a little bit more. I think from a coaching perspective, I have noticed this often when people come to Australia, not exclusively people with British background, but people from the European countries in particular think, oh, they're Australian, what would they know about football? And they sort of feel that they're going to dominate the landscape. Whereas in actual fact, I think the work we've done with coach development in the last 15, 20 years here, of course it could improve, but I think there's been some strides taken, whereas we're not the sort of backwater for football. I think from that perspective, we've produced a lot of good coaches, and there's a lot of qualified coaches and experienced coaches that I think would stack up well against anyone sort of internationally. And you're seeing now with Ange Postecoglou doing sort of great works in Scotland. I don't think he's going to be the last by any means, but I think hopefully we see people like Ange move that way, because I think it's obviously great for him and he's doing well individually, but I think it also helps people understand perhaps the good things that we're doing within coach education and football generally.
I find similar experiences with the US. A lot of coaches, they do think it is a backwater. Then they do think they're going to climb the ladder very quickly because obviously it's not a football country. People don't know what they're doing, and they're going to be blessed by my experience and knowledge. And then very quickly they hit a brick wall, realizing no, there's quite a lot of very talented, qualified people over there that are already doing good things. And just simply by being from a football country and watching the Premier League every week, you're not suddenly going to be top dog in that area. So that's interesting.
I think people, in the US, that's a great example. And I even spoke to someone who was on the US national team staff at the time, and he actually said to me, he goes, "I hope you're not coming over here just to be another coach with an accent, because that potentially might win you some votes with the parents. But I think if you don't know what you're doing, regardless of where you're coaching, you're going to get worked out fairly quickly. And I think perhaps with the US or Australia, with the strides they've taken in coach development, hopefully you're going to get found out even quicker than you used to."
Funny you say that, coach with an accent, because I've noticed over the years there's a lot more venom from American coaches, whereas I felt a lot more instant respect years ago. And then as time went by, I think there's been so many just utter clowns have gone to work in the US thinking they're God's gift to coaching, and insulting the landscape and just assuming that every American by default is inferior in terms of their football knowledge and ability. And the accent, I know for a fact, it got me undue credibility with a lot of people simply because of the way I spoke.
It's crazy to think about, but it still exists. And I think in the US, probably more than Australia, we've been a little bit more skeptical for some time. But, I can see the animosity that coaches might unwillingly give.
And that's rightly so.
Yeah, well, it's that attitude of this guy with an accent's coming over taking my job, and he's only getting my job because he's got the accent, So certainly there are some frustrated coaches out there. But, I think I would like to think, and I know it doesn't exist in all occasions, but I would like to think that regardless of where you're from, where you're born, how you speak, that if you're good at your job, then eventually you're going to get an opportunity. And hopefully, if you get that opportunity, you take it.
Regarding that animosity, I have found that a lot of American coaches are constantly complaining about their access to coaching education to get their licenses to be able to get a job. So they've got their aspirations to work at a decent level, and they can't get the licenses to work there. And there are plenty of very talented, skilled American coaches who probably would have the same knowledge or ability as a B or an A licensed coach, but they're still only a D or C because they can't get the license. So when a Brit comes over with a higher license, they look at us being, well, obviously you're revered because you've got an accent. Potentially, you're not as good. You've been fast tracked through a B license. So, because I know over here we complain a lot about access to courses, and every year there's far more applicants for a B license than there are positions. But in the US, my experience is it's about 10 times worse. So I get that people are stuck on a license, they're stuck on that rung on a ladder for a long time because there's not enough courses. So rightly, they do feel quite aggrieved when a Brit with less experience and less knowledge, but a better certificate comes along. So is it easy to get on courses in Australia? Is coach education a good standard? Is it accessible?
I'm slightly biased because I work in coach education as well. So I'd like to think it's of a good standard. It's an ever-changing landscape. We're going through changes with it at the moment. It hasn't been my experience in either Australia or the US that it was particularly difficult to get on courses, not within the country. I think if I was an Australian looking to get on a UEFA course, a UEFA A, say, in England, I think I would find that a lot more challenging than getting on an A license in Australia or America. Of course, you've got to meet all the prerequisites, but I think that's the same in every country. I think in the States and not in all circles, but I think it doesn't seem that the qualifications in the States are valued as highly as they are in other countries. There's a lot of people in the States in reasonably high positions in youth development or the college game or even the semi-pro game with limited education, or perhaps not education, but limited formal qualifications. Whereas you wouldn't necessarily see that as much in the Australian game. I know certainly in the UK, you wouldn't see that at all. You know, to work at any level, youth level, part-time jobs in academies, you're even looking at A license or pro licenses. So yeah, I didn't necessarily think it was an issue getting on courses, but I did feel that the US courses in particular perhaps weren't valued as much as the UEFA courses, and having not done too many licenses in the States, mine have predominantly been done in Australia. I couldn't really comment as to whether they're better or worse. But yeah, I didn't personally feel it was an issue getting on courses, but then I was working in, I suppose, major cities for the majority of the time in the States. So perhaps it was more accessible for me.
I am seeing a lot more coaching CVs with Australian licenses on there. So I think people are going down to the work and then taking the opportunities to get that. So last couple of questions. I know it's getting late for you down there. So I really appreciate your time.
No problem.
One about opportunities for players. Because over here, obviously, we've got the academy pathway goes into senior teams, and there's a football pyramid with promotion and relegation. Could you give us a basic overview of what it's like if, say you're a 14-year-old boy and you've got aspirations to play pro and you're fairly good? What does it look like for young players?
Yeah, so the top level here, well, in name in any case, but for the most part, the top level of youth football is the National Premier League. And then each state's got its own National Premier League youth teams. So there are 21 National Premier League youth teams in Western Australia. So if you're a decent 14-year-old, you'd hopefully be playing in the under 14s, under 15s for one of those 21 clubs. And then as you go up through the ranks, you could play under 18s, under 20s in the National Premier League. And then the next step up is the National Premier League first team. And then that's the second tier of professional football in the country. And I say professional because it's technically a professional league, but in reality, it's perhaps more semi-professional from a financial standpoint. From a sort of football pyramid perspective, you've obviously got the A-League, and then below that, you've got the NPL, as I mentioned, and then the state leagues, so State 1, State 2, and some of the states have got a State 3 as well. So there's about 4 or 5 tiers of, again, they're classified as professional leagues, but in reality, there's about 4 or 5 tiers of semi-professional football. And then hopefully, if you're good enough, you're getting noticed in one of those tiers and you're getting selected to play in the A-League. But as I mentioned sort of at the start of our chat, there's not a huge amount currently, there's not a huge amount of opportunities for Australian players in that league. Some clubs will promote from within better than others. But as I said, with only sort of 10 or 12 teams, with fairly small playing rosters, you know, you're probably only looking at 100, 150 contracts nationwide. So that's, maybe I've sold that a little bit short, perhaps a little bit above that. But either way, when you compare the amount of opportunities, say in England with the English game, whereas you guys are professional right down a sort of conference north-south now, I suppose, there's a lot more opportunities. Yes, it's more competitive, but there's a lot more opportunities to get picked up, in my opinion.
Does that affect the dreams and aspirations of kids? I mean, are they playing football because it's a hobby, or do some of them dream of, you know, scoring goals for the national team and winning trophies as a professional?
Well, I'm sure a lot of them do dream, but you know, it's a hard road. I never got anywhere near that level, so there's a lot sort of better people to speak to than me just about how hard it is. But yeah, it may well be their aspirations, and hopefully as coaches we can help them on the way. But it is a very, very shallow pool of players that actually make it to that level.
The last one then, going to paint a hypothetical, because I'm pretty sure, and you may be able to correct me here, that Australia has a year-long working visa for people that are under 30.
That's correct.
And Canada does the same one, actually. And so let's pretend 25-year-old Brit who's a coach fancies going to Australia to hopefully find a coaching position. When they get there, where would you recommend they start off? Because I know that the southeast has got a lot more big cities and there's a bit more densely populated than the rest of it. How easy would it be able to find part-time or full-time jobs, and would they then have to supplement it with anything else? Because this is really, I think, what people want to know. I want to go to Australia, so how do I get there? And if you're under 30, this might be the best option.
Yeah, look, it's not easy from a full-time perspective. You're right, though. If you're under 30, that visa still exists. And I've worked with people that have initially come over on those visas, and then some of them have stayed and found something else, and some of them have gone back with obviously a year of good experiences. I think if you're looking at making coaching a full-time career, it's not impossible, but I would say that it's very, very challenging if you're not in one of the capital cities. I would also recommend anyone that's looking at coming over to do as much research into the area they think that they're going to go into, and try and speak to coaches that are on the ground, so to speak. because the last thing you want to do is sort of end up in an area and then find that you've got no contacts, there's no opportunities there. So definitely to research it as much as possible before they come. But then when they come, yeah, look, I guess be prepared to supplement your coaching with perhaps another source of income. If you've come over for a year-long sort of holiday visa, then maybe you've come over with a bit of savings and you don't need to do that, which is great. But not everyone sort of has that luxury. So definitely, coming over and being prepared to work potentially in another industry as well as football. Also working at, one of the NPL or state league clubs, typically, not always, but typically they've got a little bit more resources. So from a financial perspective, there might be more opportunities there. But also coming over with qualifications, and if you don't have qualifications, then being prepared to obtain some when you're in the country. That'd be my advice.
Thank you very much. That's really good stuff, Dan. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for staying up late for us.
No problem.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you. So thank you once again, and best of luck with everything going forward.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, and good luck with everything yourself.
Thank you to Dan for coming on, and thank you for listening to the show. I really enjoy all these very much. It's great fun to talk football and coaching with talented, knowledgeable people who've been all over the world and worked in many different capacities. So much of your career development can come from listening to and observing others. So please do us a favour and like, share, subscribe and comment. Dan and all the guests are always happy to chat to you further. I'll be taking a break for a couple of months as I have travel and studying coming up, but you still have around 90 episodes to enjoy going back a few years, long beyond my tenure here when Matt Ward was still the host. Remember to keep checking the ball for jobs in wonderful places including Australia. Thanks for listening and see you again soon.